All right, so I'm gonna get started here. Looks like our guest has come or is online. So first, I want to welcome everybody to No Limits. We started No Limits several years ago to share people's experiences that have done things outside of what was thinkable at the time. A lot of those things at that time, maybe they were unthinkable, and then later they just become common. And so trying to understand that journey is important. And we found that it's the same basic journey across multiple industries. So it's not specific to any one particular industry. It's this idea of questioning, is that all we can do? And when people do that, we push the world and society just a little bit. And so today we're going to hear from Aaron Robinson. So Aaron is at United Airlines, and United, although we work with, have been working with United on a few things and some other local airlines, they're trying to look at this idea, which is kind of audacious, and that is to, when you fly, as you probably know, those massive engines burn a lot of fuel. And so as we're trying to move into a world where there's less climate impact, they become part of the equation, just like the energy companies we work with and everybody else. So trying to think outside of just what we've all gotten so used to whenever you sit down on an aircraft, I think is really important, as we're trying to expand our thinking into what might be imaginable that's different. So with that, I'll let Jay say a couple words and welcome everybody, and welcome Aaron.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Pat. First, I'd like to just remind everybody to mute themselves if they haven't already until the end, when we'll open for the Q&A portion. If for any reason your feed is unstable, feel free to switch off your cameras as well. We'll be holding all the questions asked either via chat or to the end. You can also feel free to ask your questions verbally and unmute yourself at that point. So by way of a brief introduction, for those who don't know, Oceanit first engaged with United Airlines several years ago, specifically to test Aeropel nanotreatments with the materials team. And our first tests were on aircraft from United's Guam fleet, primarily looking at aircraft corrosion and erosion issues. Guam is an incredibly corrosive environment. The key impact was demonstrating the potential of a water-based surface treatment to address surface protection challenges when it came to operating commercial aircraft out of United's Guam hub. So we conducted 4 months of testing, and there was a positive outcome, though unfortunately the initial test aircraft was rotated out of Guam and back to the US mainland. But we saw significant benefits when it came to corrosion and erosion challenges, and also benefits in drag reduction, which could potentially have a major impact in fuel savings, emissions reduction, and so on. So currently, Oceanit is taking the learnings from United and our other deployments of Aeropel, and we found that it has, in fact, extreme valuable impact for airframes, environmental control systems, fuel tanks, both in commercial aviation and for government and DoD clients. So now I'd like to introduce my friend, Aaron Robinson. Aaron manages United Airlines Eco-Skies program, focusing on sustainable aviation fuel development, corporate customers, emissions reductions, and external communications. And during his time leading the program, United has been recognized as Air Transport World's Eco-Airline of the Year twice, Newsweek's highest ranked airline globally for environment, and the highest rated US airline by Carbon Disclosure Project each year. After leading the fuel conservation program at Northwest Airlines, he transitioned to environment at post-merger Delta Airlines, where he oversaw all aspects of compliance with the EU ETS, represented Delta in developing its climate change strategy, and led numerous internal sustainability programs that pushed the airline's emissions and published the airline's emissions and sustainability reports. Aaron has also worked in airport operations, financial analysis, operational reliability, and cargo safety. And in addition to serving at Air Transport World, he's also worked at the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority and at Rolls-Royce. He is the founder of simairline.net, an online flight simulation organization, true flight nerd like me, and he holds a BA in economics from Carleton College, an MBA from University of Texas, and his private pilot's license. So with that, welcome, Aaron.
Great, thanks so much, Jay, for the introduction, and Pat as well, and of course, thanks for having me here. Screen share is coming up, and I believe, yes, I believe it's now up. So happy to talk with you about the world of innovation that's going on, certainly in airlines, to advance decarbonization. And I think this has certainly been a big challenge for airlines, and innovation in airlines maybe not always things that go in hand these days, as kind of the pace has changed, slowed down over the decades as we've really matured. But we're trying to turn that on again, right? And really innovate our way towards decarbonizing the industry as a whole. Our own CEO, Scott Kirby, is a huge believer in this. And he says that this is really one of his top priorities as a CEO, and something he wants to see a pathway towards accomplishing during his time for us. And it's not just an important thing to do from a business perspective, and ensuring that we're going to be around for the future and have kind of a future in which we don't have to constrain and limit demand. But also one, from a moral perspective, and just something that is critical. And he's got a lot of kids. I think the number is up to 7 now. But he and certainly all of us, right, want to see that we do have a future for our children, and a positive future as well. Over the last few years, we've certainly seen a lot of activity in this space and action. And climate groups have been increasing their focus on aviation, and movements like the flight shaming movement, have been looking to constrain demand, and we've been looking and working as an industry, and here at United as well, around how do we respond to this? How do we have a better story to tell? How do we demonstrate real, tangible action and not just good words? But maybe backing up a little bit from this, I think transportation really has always had challenges around sustainability. You go back millennia and you look in the Mediterranean, and the Romans had actually kind of deforested a lot of Italy because they needed to build all of their triremes to get around. And even looking in kind of in Europe in the 1500s, 1600s, England actually was starting to run out of tall ship masts for it. And so part of the American Revolution, one of the big challenges was there was a big source of their timber that they needed to support the Royal Navy potentially disappearing. And, they were able to maintain that with Canada, but, certainly a big challenge there. Still more timber here, right? Railroads. I mean, here in the United States, as we were building the Transcontinental Railroad, a lot of pieces kind of missing around that. And ultimately, I think each mile of track that got built, needed 140 oak trees, and that would only last a decade at most. And then urbanization, as we kind of move into cities. I mean, New York City in 1900. Every single day, you would get 2.5 million pounds of horse manure, 60,000 gallons of liquid kind of coming from them, and 20 horses dying per day. So, pretty scary, right? In terms of like, how do you manage that as a whole? And then, in the modern world, we're of course using plenty of oil to power our vehicles. I think the big story of all of this is sustainable transportation is very difficult, right? And there's 2 solutions. One is you can restrain that demand, which I don't think anyone really wants to do, or you can figure out how do you diversify, right? How do you diversify and not just have oil only as a solution, but potentially other sources as well. So that way you do have, a sustainable and hopefully decarbonized transportation and ultimately economy as well. A big challenge, though, to all of this is really sustainability, and the improvements for it have to be what I call drop-in solutions, and they have to drop into existing infrastructure. And why is this important? Well, let's take some examples in the real world, right? So like the dollar coin, it's been brought into service or brought back into service multiple times by the US government. We still haven't been able to make it work. It doesn't fit in vending machines. It doesn't fit in parking meters. There's not a slot for it at the grocery. And so people just have never really adopted it. Double-decker buses. Hey, it's a great solution in London. Here in Chicago, where I live, the challenge is we've got a lot of underpasses, and so that bus isn't going to go very far in the city until it hits one of those. And then, another example here, the Dvorak keyboard. It was patented in the 1930s. It was demonstrated to be quite substantially faster at typing. But here, the infrastructure is people's minds and fingers. And, it doesn't matter if it types faster if people are used to the QWERTY keyboard we have in front of us. So, I mean, all of this is to say that, new technology is great. It's got to fit the existing infrastructure. And maybe tying this back just to, our kind of look at antiquity. I mean, even the space shuttle, some of the technology specifications we have today and kind of in the modern world, you can trace it back, right? You can go back and trace, the size and kind of dimensions of the rocket boosters on the space shuttle, tracing it all the way back literally to, the width of Roman chariots. But here in aviation, we've got the same challenge too. The 737s we're flying today, we've got these nice, cool scimitar winglets on them. Well, actually, the better solution would be what the Navy has on their equivalent aircraft, and it's these raked wingtips here. The challenge is we'd have to expand beyond the existing gate box, and ultimately you have to regate hundreds of airports. So you have to think through, how to avoid this kind of infrastructure shift and fit into the world you have today. And actually, Boeing, when they're looking at their new 777s, they recognize they had that problem. The wingspan's too wide, and so their new answer is folding wingtips, in fact, to get around that constraint. And so how do we expand the infrastructure, or at least fit into it by adjusting kind of what we have today? All right, so that's some background to set the stage. Here's a look at what United is doing. Uniquely for us, we've said we're going to be an airline that commits to net zero emissions by 2050. But uniquely for us, we're the only airline thus far that has said we're going to do it without the use of offsets. So we've got really 4 levers to get there, and I'll talk through each of those today. The first is innovating new aircraft and engine technology. And we've been really doing this for decades. Demand is continuing to grow. We've always been focused on fuel efficiency, and so we have to figure out how to use less fuel as fast as possible. Historically, reducing fuel use hasn't been enough, and so we're going to need a lot of low carbon sustainable fuel as well to get there and really achieve massive reductions in terms of the carbon intensity that fuel puts out. We know that's not going to be enough together, and so we're probably going to need additional levers. And since we've said no offsets, the third big piece for us is carbon capture. We're going to actually be directly capturing CO2 from the atmosphere. And then a final piece to this is really how do we appeal to eco-conscious customers? How do we build them, involve them in the process, make them feel good about flying on United? And so this isn't just about kind of worrying about our cost basis and costs going up, but how can we actually differentiate the brand and make customers feel good, feel comfortable with flying, and potentially as well in the long run, win business for United by having us stand out essentially as a company that customers want to do business with. All right, so let's dive into each of these a little bit more. When we look at fuel efficiency, this is really something we've always been focused on as an airline. On the left here is the Boeing 247 we flew with in the 1930s. We've got the Boeing 777 on the right. We're still flying these today. And you can see on the bottom some comparative stats. The interesting ones, I think, are certainly kind of a longer range, obviously a bigger size, faster speed. I love this one. To cross the country back then required 15 stops to refuel. But a big piece to it, right at the very bottom, you can see here, it took 190 gallons per passenger to cross the country back then. It takes 35 now. And what focusing on fuel efficiency enabled was all of this scale up to happen. By having less fuel required per passenger meant we were then able to build a bigger aircraft and put more people on board and extend the range quite a bit further, so we didn't have those 15 stops. So fuel efficiency has really been a critical part of aviation for decades. At United, we've been pretty proud to do our part in advancing that. I mean, we've been the launch customer for 18 different aircraft designs in our history. Here's kind of the latest one, certainly the 787-10, which we took delivery of, first one a few years ago. And then the 737 MAX 10, waiting kind of word on when that first aircraft is going to arrive for us, but probably in the next, I think it's in the next 2 years roughly or so. A few weeks ago, we actually announced a very large aircraft order for us. It was the biggest we ever had, and it takes our overall order book actually above 500 aircraft. Reducing fuel use is part of this, right? And I think the unique part to highlight on this is kind of two numbers for you. The first is that every year we're spending up to $3 billion on improving our fuel efficiency through our new aircraft orders. The second is just the magnitude of this. So United today, we've got about 800 mainline aircraft. This new order is equivalent to replacing 2/3 of our mainline fleet. And that's more than any other US network or low-cost carrier. So it's really a sizable investment in terms of improving that efficiency. The downside, right, you can see is each of these new aircraft, it squeezes some CO2 out, but it's not going to get that much, right? All of this effort is only going to get about an 11% improvement in efficiency. And so ultimately, we're going to need quite a bit more here. All right, so what else are we doing? Well, actually, we have our own corporate venture fund, and this goes and invests in new companies. It's invested in a few that are more on kind of the distribution space or the product space, but a big focus of it as well is on sustainability and how do we advance sustainable aviation together. And so I'll be talking through each of these examples and giving a quick overview of each of these kind of investments we've made thus far. First one is Archer Aviation. You can see here, it looks pretty slick. This is actually a 4-passenger aircraft. This is really for an urban market. So getting people to the airport, kind of over ground congestion, and getting them, much more efficiently. And actually, when you look at it, kind of versus driving, say, in a congested city, you actually get nearly a 50% reduction in those overall emissions. I think the exciting part about electric aircraft is there's this potential to scale up, and if you pair it up with renewable electricity, you can potentially get a net zero aircraft. So that's the focus of Heart Aerospace, which is another one of our electric aircraft investments. This is actually bringing in a relatively small-sized aircraft for us, only 19 seats. The great part about electric aircraft is not only is it a lower fuel cost, it's actually because you have a simpler non-combustion engine, you actually get a massive improvement in maintenance costs as well. That makes it a very cost-effective airplane. This aircraft is probably about 5 years away from entering into service, but we're really excited that it could enable coming back into a lot of smaller markets that we've exited over the years instead, and really enabling those small service, small communities as well. All right, so the exciting one, I think probably the most speculative of the bunch, is Supersonic, and we are partnering up with a company called Boom Aerospace. Their plan is to be bringing Mach 1.7 aircraft, so twice as fast as today. This is going to take through the end of the decade to get that into service. And the exciting part for it is their plans are, yes, supersonic aircraft do need a lot more fuel, but they are designing this aircraft to be able to fly on 100% sustainable fuel, which could enable it to then be a net zero aircraft from day one of operations. And so, being able to, serve our existing routes, Hawaii to the West Coast, let's say, pulling that from kind of the normal 5 or 6 hours down to 3, for instance, certainly very exciting for us. 2 to 3 hours, actually, I guess I'd say. All right, so on to sustainable aviation fuel, low carbon fuel, and what is it? Well, the graph on the left here shows you kind of the life cycle of a typical conventional jet fuel. And you start out by extracting oil from the ground. You transport that oil over to a refinery. They have industrial processes there that prepare the oil and convert it to jet fuel, and then ultimately bringing it to the aircraft. And of course, the majority of the emissions get produced when the aircraft is actually using the jet fuel, combusting it, and producing the energy. Well, sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF for short, is different. It's a closed loop cycle, and one of kind of avoiding emissions. So what we focus on in particular is using waste products, and using waste products that would otherwise be decomposing and generating their own sets of methane emissions. And as a result of avoiding these emissions by reusing that carbon in a life cycle, we're able to get a substantial reduction on the order of 80% reduction in those life cycle emissions of the jet fuel. So very exciting. This is really the biggest platform we have to be cutting our emissions. Wait, what about electric aircraft that we talked about? Well, yes, we are incredibly interested in them. The problem is it's very hard to get those aircraft to be able to have sufficient scale for our operations. So you saw 4 seats, 19 seats. The problem is today energy density of batteries is just too heavy. The energy density of the batteries is too low, which means the batteries have to be too heavy. And so you would have a much larger aircraft. You may remember Solar Impulse 2 flying around the world several years ago. One of my personal heroes involved in that. They had 2 people on board. They went 45 miles an hour. They had a wingspan of a 747. And when some equipment broke, they got stuck in Hawaii for 3 months. So I hope you had a chance to certainly go and visit them when they were around at the time. And then as well, right, people have range anxiety plenty of their electric vehicle. Well, imagine having range anxiety, over the Pacific Ocean. And, the dark spots here is kind of 60 minutes close to an airport. And, in the industry, we call this ETOPS. If you want to fly on 2 engines, beyond that 60 minutes, you have to have a special certification called Extended Twin Engine Operational Performance Standards. Very long and complicated version. Easier version is engines turn or the passengers swim, right? So, we want to make sure that, yes, hopefully electric can scale up at some point, but SAF fitting our existing fleet today is really the answer for us in the near term and medium term certainly as well. All right, so what are we doing in this space? Well, quite a bit actually. We've really had a long kind of decade plus investment into SAF. That's started really in 2009. We had our first kind of test flight of any US airline. That was a 2-hour flight. So pretty small stakes at that time. In 2016, we actually advanced that and we started using SAF in our operations every single day. It's the equivalent of about 3 flights per day the last several years. And then today, where are we? Well, we've bought more SAF than any other airline globally. We've got almost half of kind of the industry commitments to SAF going forward. And, we're certainly looking to advance that even further. All right, so we'll look at whom we partner with today. Well, 2016 and to the present, that was an agreement with a company called World Energy. They're using waste fats, oils, and greases. And they have a production facility very close to Los Angeles Airport. We actually truck that fuel over into and deliver it to the airport. And, it gets a substantial reduction in those life cycle emissions, nearly an 80% reduction. Going forward, we actually also have an investment of $30 million in a company called Fulcrum. And for that, we've got an agreement to really scale that up quite a bit. Not just the 5 million gallons per year we have from World Energy, but 90 million gallons per year from Fulcrum. Their production process, it's a different technology. It's called the Fischer-Tropsch process. But their plan is to actually use landfill waste. And the exciting part about this, and really any waste, is you don't have to grow a crop, right? If you grow a crop, the challenge to it is you need a lot of land, you need a lot of water, you need a lot of fertilizer, you need a lot of labor. With waste, and especially landfill waste, no one wants it. And other companies that have actually invested in Fulcrum as well, they're getting benefits too. So one example is Waste Management is a co-investor of ours. Normally they would collect the waste and they would have to pay a landfill to accept it. Now they can just deliver it to Fulcrum, potentially even disposing of that for zero economic cost to Waste Management, potentially zero cost for Fulcrum as well. So that really helps the economics quite considerably. Actually, my slide here is out of date. They have finished construction on their facility in just the last few weeks in Reno. And then they've got a second facility planned in the Chicago area in the city of Gary in Indiana. And that one will be their first jet fuel facility. So that one's still a couple years away. So SAF is really exciting for us. The challenge, certainly is actually, let me go back here. This 90 million gallons from Fulcrum, when we get to that level in several years from now, that's still only going to be 2% of United's global total. And so we're going to need a lot from that, a lot more to come. And Fulcrum in particular, that agreement is the biggest end of the industry. It's only hitting 2% of United's needs. So we're going to need a lot more. But, I'm certainly optimistic about this because history shows that technology has found ways to scale up and achieve this kind of scale. And the graph on here is a little hard to read. It's because it's from the 1950s. And it was actually put together by the Air Force Research Laboratory. And so they were graphing on here kind of time on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, how fast humanity is able to propel objects. And what they found is over time, certainly that ability to increase speed has increased from it's got the Pony Express label down here to trains to automobiles, and then of course the Wright brothers and onward. And they were trying in the 1950s, the Air Force was trying to extrapolate forward and see what was possible, what could they do to predict where technology was going. And they were really shocked when they did it, because the projections showed when you extrapolate that curve outward, you would be able to have enough speed in 1957 to put something in orbit. And it turns out the prediction was right. Of course, the only problem was it was the wrong country that did it. It was the Soviets that did it instead. But then, they were equally shocked when they saw that according to the model, you should be able to travel and send people to the moon by 1970. Well, good news there. We beat the curve, right? The government invested a lot of money in research to make it happen and made it happen faster. And that's what we need to happen here today too. All right, so to move on to, some other aspects of our strategy, kind of last few things here. Carbon capture and sequestration. We've got a investment in a company called 1.5. Their plan is to build really the first industrial-sized direct air capture facility in the United States. This is going to be located in the Permian Basin, so think West Texas. And then each of these facilities, like you see here, it's going to capture 1 million tons of CO2 per year. If you wanted to do this with trees instead, let's say, and plant a forest or protect a forest, you could do it. You would need about 3,000 times as much land to accomplish it. So in terms of scalability and really achieving the massive reductions we need, as an industry, as an airline, and as a society, we think this technology is going to be really critical to getting there. All right, so how does it work? Well, a couple steps in it. Of course, the atmosphere is filled with CO2. Those fans you saw in the previous slide, air is going to pass through those fans, and there's an absorbent in it which actually sticks to those carbon molecules, and then it lets the oxygen and nitrogen in the air continue to pass through it. We then separate the CO2 from the absorbent, and then we just essentially capture that existing CO2, and then ultimately we can store that CO2 underground, or potentially in the future we can use it to create a carbon neutral or even a carbon negative product like fuel or plastics or otherwise. Final piece really for us is really thinking about travelers, right? And how do we improve their experience and make them feel good, and certainly reduce their impact that they see throughout the travel journey. A big piece we're advancing is, how do we educate travelers? How do we bring them in and involve them and help them make an informed decision? And so we're actually testing out concepts like this on United.com, where we show actual CO2 values for customers, and do we highlight kind of what that greenest flight is to them, and what's that customer impact and uptake and reaction. At the airport, it's obviously reducing components of waste and improving, moving into LEED certified facilities. And then certainly the products on board the aircraft. And the one I'll highlight here is actually the second bullet. It used to be that the amenity kits we would have on board, we would, if one of those items was used, we would toss the whole kit in the trash. And instead what we do today is we go in, we pull out all of those unused items, we send them to an organization called Clean the World. They pair it up then, so think like socks, for instance. They then pair those items up, socks, combs, and so on that we have. They pair it up with soaps and shampoos from hotels. They package them into hygiene kits and they send them to homeless shelters or to disaster relief and organizations like that. And then a final piece here really about combining a lot of these aspects, right? Combining the SAF, which has a challenge around being more expensive to produce, combining it with kind of how do we appeal to customers. Earlier this year, one of the programs we launched was called the Eco-Skies Alliance. And this was, having a number of our corporate customers step up, paying that green premium for the SAF. And then ultimately, we were able to increase our SAF usage by 250% as a result. Those companies are then getting greenhouse gas reduction emissions that they can claim against their own travel. And we're really excited about this because it's a way to break that cycle, enable more SAF in our operation, start that decarbonization, make it affordable, and really everyday available every day for our customers. The other exciting piece about this is, you look at these customer names on here, it's from a wide range of industries. And so that's very exciting to us because it demonstrates really that carbon neutral travel, it's something that everyone's after. And, I think very importantly as well, there's a willingness to pay for it. It's not just surveys where customers say, I want this, but I'm not willing to pay for it. You have to give it to me. As a matter of course, but there is an ability and an interest to make that happen. All right, so circling back to innovation here, why do we focus on sustainability here at United? I think it's really just part of innovation. It's part of our overall innovation story, and you can see it on here. It's always been part of our core culture, whether it's in safety elements, operational improvements, customer service. to sustainability today. Innovation has always been part of our business. It's always been something we subscribe to and believe is the path to success. And sustainability is just the latest generation and incarnation, really, of making that happen. And so, finally here, in 2019, we flew, the most eco-friendly flight possible that we could. We used SAF on it. We used all the operational efficiency measures we could to reduce the fuel use. We offset kind of the remainder, and we introduced as all of this zero cabin waste materials kind of on the catering on board. This is what we want to have happen every single day. We want to have sustainable flying, really become the reality and the norm and the standard for the future. And so that's what we're driving towards. So happy to take questions. And Jay, back over to you.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to just kind of bring up something we've been involved with, and I'm curious what United is trying to do, and that's regarding hydrogen. We're involved in a bunch of hydrogen, not only production, but there's some interesting ideas in transportation using liquid ammonia. And there's a lot of stuff going on in that space. So how do you guys see that?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. So hydrogen is an interesting new space, and I'd say like electric aircraft have been talked about and being innovated on for the last 10 years or so. Hydrogen's really only been explored for the last 2 years. And so it's a lot more nascent. I think it's certainly a very interesting application, but it's also got a very similar challenge to electric aircraft in that at the moment you got an energy density problem, and so you've got to figure out how to overcome that to really scale it as a solution. The other two big challenges we see tied to hydrogen, one is, and electric as well actually, is, we can go out and develop an electric airliner or a hydrogen powered airliner. Is that the best use of those resources though? Or should we be using that renewable electricity and renewably produced hydrogen as inputs into sustainable fuel instead that can power the existing fleet and provide answers to those aircraft we already have? The second kind of challenge I would point to is one of scaling up that technology. So Airbus has actually kind of laid down a big bet on hydrogen, and they said this is the future. We're going to have a hydrogen-powered airliner in 2035, which is a bit of a ways off. But then let's say alternatively here in the United States, Boeing and society decides electric aircraft is the answer for that market. You start off with a small aircraft, a domestic airliner, and let's say that North America goes the electric route, Europe goes the hydrogen route, and then in 20 or 30 years, those aircraft and the technology has scaled so you can cross the ocean. Well, then you've actually got a problem because there's no infrastructure on the other side of the Atlantic. And in the developing world, what do they then do? Which technology do they adopt? And so I think it's also one where we've got to see as an industry a clear winner and a clear direction to go, because otherwise we could end up in a very dangerous situation where we get conflicting investments instead of synergistic ones.
Sure. And last comment. Yeah, of course that's true. But in the beginning, the idea of experimentation and trying things. So it's not abundantly clear that either one of those is the winner. I mean, these things have been talked about for a long time.
Yeah.
And yet, I think most people would agree there's a lot more we can do. And that's not going to occur unless there's some risk taking.
Yeah.
And the risk taking, I think, needs to build into it from a context standpoint, end users like United, right? So trying something that may not work doesn't mean it's a failure as much as it's an opportunity to learn something, to kind of push where people think the edges are. And that's, I think that's how it's actually going to happen. I mean, you mentioned the guys were the Swiss that did the electric aircraft. So I did visit with them when they were here.
Oh, great.
And I thought that was a cool experiment. it was an experiment, right? It was really just to try something where you can learn a lot about, what is and what isn't working. So with those things you learn, you can build them into the next generation.
Yeah, and I
That's how I
think that
think these things really progress.
yeah, thanks for that. And I think that actually raises a great point of kind of risk taking and learnings, as a whole. And I like to say that in some sense there's a conflict, right, in terms of kind of an airline's typical approach to doing business versus innovation and sustainability, right? If I'm a baseball player and I'm successful 1 out of 3 times as a hitter, I'll be in the Hall of Fame. If I'm a venture capitalist and 1 out of 3 of my investments pay off, I'll be one of the richest people in the world. But if I'm successful with 1 out of 3 investments in an airline, or I might be out of a job, right? And so, how do you, given kind of our existing safety culture and conservative approach, so how do you reconcile those together? And then, yeah, to your point about kind of solar impulse and learnings, I think learnings are hugely important as well. And when United was kind of going out and doing its first flights on sustainable fuel, I was at another airline, and when I approached my leadership with the concept, they said, "No, this is that's a PR. It's a PR play. There's nothing to it." And I said, "No, there's a lot you can learn in the process of doing things. And even if it doesn't get you to your end destination, you can build a lot of expertise by doing things directly." And so, like, for me, when I was getting my pilot's license, I had to do a lot of studying, and a lot of reading to get there. But I will tell you that every time I got in the aircraft, pushed the throttle forward, and went up into the sky, I learned a heck of a lot more than just reading the book.
Absolutely. And and last comment on that, we're doing a what's called a joint industry partnership with Italian and Dutch international or national oil companies on hydrogen with a new technology. I think Department of Energy is involved. I don't know if United is interested in participating in something like that, but it's a whole new way to do things, and it's risky, but it's also really interesting. So I think the reason these other international companies are interested in it is because this is a space that hasn't really been explored, but if it works, it could transform things. So maybe at a later time, we'll have someone follow up with you and see if you want it. It's a JIP. It's called Joint Industry Partnership. Generally, it's a lot of energy companies, but if there's a big focus in rethinking high energy fuel, might be an idea there, because these guys obviously have a lot going on in refining and production, and ultimately that's the skill you need to service an airline. Right,
Great,
Shell
yeah.
Oil and Eni, right? I mean, that's the kind of industry where they produce massive amounts of fuel.
Great. Yeah, I mean, always happy to have the conversation and explore it.
All right. I'll let others ask some questions. Thanks.
So if anybody has any other questions, you're able to unmute yourselves and start your video, and you can chime in. In the meantime, though, Aaron, I had a couple questions of my own. I'll just dive in. But what do you think of all the things that you presented today and the pathway that you have to the zero emissions? What do you think is the single biggest hurdle in reaching the goal? Is it economics? Is it political?
Yeah, I like to say that there's kind of a few barriers in place here, and really 3 in particular. I think there's certainly an economic barrier, right? And kind of in the form of how much does it cost? I mean, for us, the sustainable fuel, is kind of 2 to 3 times more expensive than conventional jet fuel. And so, if we went out and bought bought and replaced all of that if it was available, we would be bankrupt as a company. So that, is a huge problem. There's also, certainly a financing gap, right? I mean, building any of these facilities, whether it's carbon capture or SAF production, each of those costs hundreds of millions of dollars. So where's that money going to come from? It certainly can't come from United. We don't have the balance sheet to be able to do that. And our venture fund is able to seed the way, but we need others to really step up and do that. But I think the final real challenge here is one of awareness. And it's one we've always kind of had a problem of how to do and handle that. And I talked about kind of what we're doing on board the aircraft. Our customer surveys consistently show that the top issue for customers on sustainability is our greenhouse gas emissions, as it should be. But the strong number two is plastic use and recycling on board. And if you look at those in terms of overall environmental impact, there is a massive gap between the two. But if you look at it in terms of visibility, the onboard product that people touch and feel every single day is much more obvious, right? And I think you see this in society as a whole, right? You look at why kind of the Prius and the Tesla were successful. It's because they were designed to look different. And so people kind of who buy those are able to show off their green credentials. And we live in a world that is, very programmed to, what can I share on social media? Well, the challenge we have around a lot of these elements, and especially greenhouse gas emissions, is that these things are invisible. And a more efficient engine, it looks about the same. It might look a little newer, a little cooler, like a 787, is kind of a little more swept back and so on. But the sustainable fuel in particular, that's out of sight, it's out of mind. And so, really figuring out how to overcome that kind of awareness gap is, I think, one of our big barriers to success.
Great, thank you. The other question that I had for you is more on the infrastructure side. We obviously have a big dependency in Hawaii on Honolulu International Airport. It kind of is what has driven a lot of the prosperity for Hawaii being more connected with the world over the past several generations here. But I was wondering if you could share some thoughts on the US infrastructure of airports more broadly. I know Pat and I certainly discuss quite often the idea of completely starting over, and that the example that we look at is Denver, Stapleton Airport. Both of us spent time in Colorado. Overnight, Stapleton Airport shut down and the new great Denver International Airport scaled up. Obviously, most cities don't have that luxury of just having great tracts of land to build a new modern airport, but we obviously have significantly aging infrastructure here, well, across the country and here. What are your thoughts on how, what the future holds for the US and US airlines in playing a part in improving that infrastructure versus designing around what we have currently?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been something that we've been had as a challenge for decades, right? And some cities in the U.S. have kind of explored second airports for decades, right? And then they never happened. And I remember 20 years ago or so, right? Seattle voters kind of voted down their light rail project for, I think it was like $2 billion, and then a decade later, they voted it in and it cost $10 billion, right, at that point in time. I mean, I think as a country, there's a huge challenge around how do you make the infrastructure fit and work. And, I think to some degree, I would love to see, can we achieve a rethink, right? And like, if you ask a kid in the 1960s to draw an airliner, he would draw a tube with wings and it would have probably 3 or 4 engines on it. If you ask a kid to draw an airliner today, he would draw a tube with some wings, and there would be two engines on it. And so we haven't, fundamentally kind of revolutionized how we undergo and think about air travel in this country, or in the world as a whole, right? And I mean, same thing, right, with cars. The cars today, yeah, they look different from 100 years ago, but there's a fundamentally kind of the same approach to it. But are there things and revolutions we can introduce? And so I think that's the big challenge. Is there's a lot of neat concepts you can do. How do you get it in practice to kind of coexist and then ultimately supplant? So, I mean, disruptive innovation, like Silicon Valley style is very interesting for that reason. But is aviation going to be an area where they spend their time and resources, a sector that's kind of had big barriers to entry, and then also one that, has a very long product development cycle too.
Great. Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up then. Thank you so much for your time, Aaron. It was really interesting. To everybody who's tuned in, we'll have a video of this posted within a few days. But thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for participating in No Limits. And Aaron, thanks again. And Pat, any final words?
No, I just, again, appreciate you sharing and hopefully give people some things to think about. Aviation is a critical part of how the world works. And I think reimagining it is something that we should consider. And we'll follow up with you on these interesting ideas we're working on with the energy companies, because I think that's how it's likely going to happen. It's you need that infrastructure, the scale, to continue to move people safely in transition. So it'll end up in a collaboration, I think, ultimately, versus just a singular person or a singular event. But with that said, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for making the time, and take care. Aloha.